So Mary is the CEO of NeRRe Therapeutics, and recently they spun out a company called KaNDy. And so this comes after Mary has had a very long career at GSK and Viv, or Vive, one of the two. Vive, other vowel. But with that, why don't you tell us more about what exactly these companies are working on?
Sure. Yeah, great to be here. So both of the companies are working on neurokinins. NeRRe Therapeutics is a company focused exclusively on neurokinin 1 antagonists, and KaNDy, which we just spun out, is focusing on a very novel dual mechanism neurokinin antagonist. So let's talk about NeRRe first. NeRRe has a pipeline of 3 neurokinin 1 antagonists. We believe that neurokinin 1 is intimately involved in neuronal hypersensitivity. So we're focusing our work on uncovering the role of blocking neurokinin receptors in neuronal hypersensitivity conditions. So we're looking primarily at conditions where the neuronal reflex is dysfunctional, so chronic refractory cough, for example, or chronic pruritus. And we are focusing our lead asset. It's actually in the clinic. It's in a phase 2B study, which is obviously very advanced in the US and in the UK. And we're hoping to be able to prove this time next year, or sort of mid next year, that we actually can have an asset to treat chronic refractory cough for which there is no current treatment. So that's NeRRe, very exciting. On the other hand, probably even more exciting for me as a woman is KaNDy Therapeutics. We set KaNDy up to create focus on what we believe actually is a transformational asset. We have this dual mechanism antagonist. We called it KaNDy because there's a neuronal complex in the brain called the KaNDy neuron, and we believe that the KaNDy neuron modulates a number of pathways, including the thermoregulatory pathway, which causes menopausal symptoms in women, and also the GnRH pathway. So it's very exciting, cutting-edge science. And we just have some data which is a confirmatory proof of concept that actually we have a compound which has the potential to transform the treatment of the menopause in women. We haven't released the data yet because Mike's busy working on patents, but we're very, very excited about this new class of compounds.
So then, why did you choose to spin out these companies, or what was the decision process from GSK?
Okay, so step back to GSK. I wasn't around at the time. My colleague over here, Mike, was around. But basically at that time, GSK, like the industry, like Merck, like Astra, were very disillusioned with neurosciences. So those who've ever worked in neurosciences know that it's a very difficult area to develop drugs in. It's a complex population, schizophrenic, manic depressives. The studies are extraordinarily difficult to replicate. So, every second study in depression fails because of placebo effect. And so it was very, very challenging. It's also difficult to prove incremental benefit over standard of care. So for a number of those reasons, the industry wholesale turned away from neurosciences. But they still believed, and GSK did at the time, that there was merit in some of the compounds. And GSK had 34 programs, something like that, running at the time. And they gave permission to some of the lead scientists to spin out. There were 3 spin-outs at the time. One of them was NeRRe, and the then head of neurosciences, Emilio Angelo Ratti, and his colleague who's with me tonight, Mike Trower, spun out and established NeRRe. And NeRRe was established to really optimize what was believed to be the undiscovered value in that neurokinin pipeline. And we think now that actually we're on to exactly the indications that they should have been focused on.
So then, have you run into the same skittishness from pharma now that we've had a whole host of failures and things like Alzheimer's, given that you're still in CNS drugs?
Yes, so we're looking at compounds in both companies with CNS mechanisms. So, the menopause is hypothalamic disorder. But we're not actually focusing on what's traditional neurosciences. So we believe that our compounds have central mechanism, but actually the symptoms that they control are peripheral symptoms. So it's slightly different. You might be referring to the recent failure of the Axovant compound. And a number of others. I mean, obviously, there are specific situations and need to be viewed on their merit. And, you know, the Axovant compound was always a punt. Everybody knew that. And it was, you know, whether or not it was, a lot of people would have betted against it working in any event. But hindsight's a great thing. We're focusing on developing compounds where we know there is a high probability they will work. So, for example, orvepitant in NeRRe, it had a proof of concept for depression. It worked in depression. But nobody just wanted to develop it at the time. We know that scientifically it achieves the receptor occupancy centrally to have an effect. And we also know that the class now, there's more and more latterly, even in the last year, precedented data to confirm the utility of NK1 antagonists in neurohypersensitivity conditions. So we actually think, and we would, wouldn't we, that, you know, the compounds we're working on in both NeRRe and our women's health compound have a high probability of success and therefore a lot of confidence moving forward in them.
But to draw the parallel with Axovant's compound, that was also a repurposed drug, and NeRRe's compound was also repurposed. How would you respond to critics that say, well, this is never going to work for perhaps similar reasons?
Well, I mean, innovation can come from many sources, you know, so innovation can come in discovering a new target, a new pathway, a new indication, you know, and a new formulation. So, you know, we believe that actually what we're doing is highly innovative, because what we're doing is we're taking these underexploited medicines and we're actually finding the innovation which is the right indication. So for our NK1 pipeline, clearly we're focusing on neuronal hypersensitivity. I think it's interesting because that term, neuronal hypersensitivity, is creeping into the parlance. A lot more people are starting to talk about, you know, these conditions that are caused by nerves being hyperexcited. And so, you know, we think that it's not repurposing, it's actually really fundamentally identifying the true utility and optimal way to use the compound. So that is innovation.
I've got one more question about just the development process. How have you found that women's health in biotech is overlooked? And could you describe some of the challenges in developing a health or a drug for women, given that most trials are done in men for fertility reasons?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, it really is a chicken and egg situation. So there's very few big pharma who are strategic about women's health anymore, so there's very little money going in. So then the VCs, when you ask them to fund a women's health asset, go, well, where am I going to get my exit? So, you know, there's no money coming from VCs, and there's precious little focus from trade. So, and we saw that through our, you know, our Series B raise last year, that it was nigh on impossible to get anyone to bite on a women's health asset. And they had all sorts of reasons, but it was essentially that they couldn't see an exit out of it because there was no interest. The fact is there's enormous interest. We just need the data to prove the benefit. And, you know, if you think about women's health, well, half the population are women, you know, and these conditions, they're not cancer, but something like menopause, the symptoms of the menopause, debilitates many women's life every single day for up to 10 years of their lives. So these are areas of enormous unmet need. And you think about the menopause, 46 million women in the US are in the menopause at any one time. And, you know, when HRT was at its peak, 15 million women were on HRT. That's a heck of a lot of women. You know, and if you think about, well, I know this because I would, but Premarin at peak was a $2 billion compound, our medicine. At today's money, that's 10 billion. That's bigger than, you know, as big as the Humiras, the Enbrels. And, you know, in a way, I think the industry has lost sight of that opportunity, but we're about to remind them of it because we're talking up this space because we really, truly believe that we have something that's quite transformational. That treats not just many symptoms of the menopause, but multiple other women's health indications. And you asked me a question about men, development in men and women. Actually, we experienced that very directly because the asset that we have, 814, had been developed in a phase 1 program in GSK, which was a very elaborate, very thorough, very comprehensive program with excellent data. But when we took it to the FDA, they said, guess what? It's in men. actually you don't have any evidence of of dose or PK or bioavailability in women. So you're going to have to go right back and repeat that. And if the studies had been done equally, then we wouldn't be in that situation. Of course, we all know why that is. We all know that phase 1 studies are done in young men because they volunteer, and all the reproductive challenges around young men are less than women. So, but the fact is, you wonder whether or not that continues to set a trend. Who knows?
So then, to shift gears more to your career and the experience that you've had spinning out these 2 companies, how would you characterize that career path as doing spin-outs as opposed to doing startups, or how would you distinguish that from your career in pharma? And could you give us a broad overview of the pros and cons of each?
Yeah, and honestly, most of my career was spent in pharma. I'm not going to say how many years, but it's in the late 20s. So, I'm an old pharma hack, basically. And, the reality is I didn't even know that this biotech environment existed. It was like a parallel universe that I knew nothing about. And it was only when I started thinking about there was a possibility of leaving GSK at one point that I started reaching out and discovered that all this went on, and there were these VCs and there was funding. So it's actually quite incredible. It says something about how focused I am when I'm in a space or something. I don't know what it says, but so what I would say is, I think if I was giving advice to anyone, I would say, look up and look around and see what the opportunities are. And I think the opening tonight about the possibilities that are out there for entrepreneurs, who, by the way, are just entrepreneurs, doesn't really matter what it is. And there's possibilities out there to use your entrepreneurialism in many ways. I would say, first of all, do that. I mean, secondly, I think about the opportunities that are in big pharma and also in biotech. Quite frankly, I couldn't do the job I do if I hadn't cut my teeth in big pharma. So there was a talk, Kevin mentioned having people who have domain expertise. The reason we can be so productive so quickly is because we're all pharma hacks. We've been there, we've done it, we've done many jobs. I had 13 jobs over 27 years in GSK. So, and all of them either in commercial or on the development interface. So, for us, this is a bit bread and butter. We're doing what would have been done every single day in a pharma company. It's not that difficult when, you've done 10,000 or how many thousand hours. So, I mean, I would definitely encourage people to work in big pharma because the skill set that you learn, the development, the exposure, the opportunity to work globally in a managed way is great. But then, obviously, the idea of taking that expertise and using it to mobilize something very quickly, which is what I think we're doing, is almost a perfect storm. And so, obviously everyone has to create their own path, but I think that path has worked very well, starting in big pharma and then moving quickly and using those skills to just mobilize. And in a way, it feels like you could be a bit of a machine. You could do it and you could keep doing it because you know how to drive the car, and you just keep driving it.
But could you? But when it comes to spin-outs versus startups, could you make that comparison a little bit more directly as opposed to pharma and startups?
Yeah. And obviously, I've not been involved in a real startup in that sense, so I can't really talk about what it means to be in a startup. And spin-outs have their pros and cons. I think the reason I got involved in the spin-out I did was because when I looked at those assets, they looked like gold-plated assets. They had all the hallmarks of something that could become a medicine, but actually just hadn't, the jewellery hadn't been uncovered. I'm not an expert in spin-outs and I'm not an expert in startups, but I think what's very important with either of them is to be, with spin-outs, is to know whether or not there's any value at all and not waste a lot of time with something that's actually not going to go anywhere. There's a reason it's been spun out. With startup, clearly, I think testing the water very quickly to see whether or not actually this really is not just a personal passion, but something that has got legs is really important. So being very objective, doing good due diligence, being being very realistic is important.
So then, also on the subject of your path and cutting your teeth, so you've done a PhD and an MBA. And it's rare to find scientists who also have the managerial skill set to run a company effectively. What did you find were the biggest challenges, and how did you rise to meet them?
Yeah. So I did my MBA pretty much after I did my PhD, so it's a long time ago. But like, I started doing a PhD, I did postdoc work in the US. I mean, I'd never considered myself an academic, and I definitely wasn't a vocational science. I just loved the funkiness of science and medicine, but I wasn't one of those, ivory tower academics ever. So it was very clear to me that I wanted to be on what I described then as the commercial side of the industry without really knowing what that was. But I knew I wanted to stay in pharmaceuticals, in medicine. So I as soon as I'd done my postdoc, I went to work as a rep in pharma. And at the time, my supervisor wouldn't even give me a reference because she said, this outrageous that someone would do that. But it was really great entry into the industry. It was very clear to me quickly, though, that I was older than everyone else, so I needed to fast track. So I did the MBA as a fast track to try and get up to speed really quickly. And did that then. But I think, scientists with MBAs could easily get lost in industry. And, looking back on my career, I was quite calculated about the steps I took. It's a bit like, this number that you showed about PhD to professor, it doesn't happen by accident. Somebody needs to really want to be a professor and think about carving out that route. I think looking back, I was quite intent on being in a certain role, and so therefore carved out a route, knowing strategically, intentionally the jobs that I needed to take, which would give me the flexibility to do what I wanted to do. And Big Pharma lets you do that. There are so many opportunities, so I had 13 jobs in 27 years. I was head of marketing for Europe, I was head of global strategy, I was head of pharmacogenetics and diagnostics in Glaxo. I got to do all those funky things that you can only do in a big pharma, but actually all those funky things prepare you then for stepping in and running your own business.
Okay, well, with that, it's time for questions from the audience. Does anyone want to have the first go? Yes, go ahead.
So you mentioned, going into a big pharma to be big finance hubs, but now you've got people that are coming out of PhDs that have the opportunity to join companies similar to yours, maybe, that can provide that kind of experience, but in a different ecosystem that doesn't move so slow. Where would you say that people at that career trajectory would go, or would you say no, still grind your teeth in big pharma for 10 years? Or?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think anyone has to grind their teeth in big pharma, and I think there's more than enough opportunities in the biotech sector to get the experience, but it doesn't happen by accident. A career path, in my opinion, needs to be plotted, and strategic intention to move into certain roles to get certain experiences. So if a young PhD wants to be a CEO of biotech, they need to build up the skills and experience and exposure in order to get to that place eventually, sooner rather than later. Obviously, if they're very entrepreneurial and very ambitious, they could be a CEO immediately, but and they could be very successful immediately. And the CEO of Roivant Sciences is an example of someone who's very ambitious and very young. But I think there's many, many different ways and many different paths, but it doesn't nothing happens by accident.
Anybody else? Yep.
I thought it was kind of interesting the way you described that some of the early trials around mental disorders and stuff are difficult to do because of placebo effects, and then also the fact that your initial trial, because young men volunteer, so it's difficult to establish a good trial. Do you think that that's a problem, that there's an issue with trial design and how the regulators approach this sort of stuff? And if it's a problem, how do you fix it?
Gosh, I couldn't hope to be an expert in trial design, honestly. It's really not my forte. But what I would say is thoughtful trial design is absolutely critical. And I know that when we got the FDA feedback, for example, that they really wanted more phase 1 data in the population in the menopause, we decided to do the best possible study that we could do with the money that we had to get the most information out of the study. So we did this beautiful, exquisite experiment with lots packed full of endpoints around, whether it's efficacy or safety endpoints or surrogate markers, looking for hard endpoints, looking for soft endpoints. So, we were very conscious that we wanted to do the best possible piece of clinical science that we could. consequently, and we did, and we've been rewarded for that in the data that we've had. So I mean that's all I would say, that every time someone's designing a study, first of all, I mean, I've been at Big Pharma watching groups thinking they're the first people who've ever designed a study. They're not. There's lots of expertise. There's lots of knowledge out there, and just make sure it achieves the endpoint, and it is as jam-packed full of opportunities to learn about the target population as possible.
Sorry, the gentleman at the very back reached to it.
I just wanted to ask about, did GSK still have an interest? And what's your end game? Are you looking to build your own company to the size of outsource it or sell it again, some product, or are you going to license it?
Yeah. No, a good question. When the pipeline was spun out, it was spun out with all its IP intact, and so there's all the IPs either owned by NeRRe or KaNDy, and there's no milestones or royalties owned to GSK, which is a really nice unencumbered position to be in. GSK is an equity stakeholder, so GSK does have an equity share and has a board observer role, so they're still involved in that sense. I mean, moving forward, I think it's a really good question because, I mean, on the women's health side, I personally would like to be this when it goes to market, be with it. It's just that I want to follow this baby all the way and see it when it's piling off the shelves. Is that likely to happen? Probably not, but given, if you'd asked me a year ago about the funding for the Women's Health Compound, I would have said, we're going to have to go public and raise money publicly because the VCs won't fund this. But actually things have changed because there was a benchmark deal not so long ago. So we feel more likely that there's a transaction that's possible sooner rather than later with that women's health asset. On the other side, it's pretty much the same story. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if the data's positive, there may be trade interest. We may progress this to an IPO. We're just keeping our options open and keeping lots of parallel options open and, no decisions. And the nice thing with the companies is that they're very well funded. So we have a super syndicate of VCs around the table. We have a really nice multinational syndicate. So we've got, big US fund, OrbiMed. We've got Dutch fund, Forbion. We've got an Irish fund. I'm delighted about that. I would be as well. Fountain Health Partners, and also of course our cornerstone original investor Advent Life Sciences, and they're all very committed to the team and to the opportunities in both companies, and will support us to do what we feel is the right thing to do to really optimize the value of those assets.
Do you still have other questions?
No.
Okay. We've got time for one more quick one. Yes.
So considering the relatively immaturity of the women's health market and the fact that your product only works on peripheral symptoms, how does the company anticipate payers to react to this, or is that something that's not being considered at this stage?
Okay, so maybe I misled you with terminology that I use. So if we just look at the market for the menopause, I mean, it's huge. Not just in numbers of women, but actually in value. So even though HRT is only used in about 30% of women who present for treatment, the HRT market is a multi-billion-dollar market. So it is an enormous market. The symptoms, a woman who's having menopausal symptoms is having distressing, debilitating symptoms 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times a day. The women we studied, they were flashing and sweating 10 times a day. They were waking at night 6, 7 times a night. All of those things which changed people's lives for 10 years. And it's almost a silent population of women who are suffering and getting nothing. And the minute you start talking about it, lots of people start saying, well, that's me. So actually they're symptoms, but they're really debilitating on a daily basis and change the quality of life. So from a payer perspective, we think that actually there is already health outcome evidence and a story to tell about how making women economically more viable again, and reducing the direct and indirect costs of the menopause is worth paying for. I mean, there's a recent study published by the British the NHS or the government around, actually workplaces should be designed to make sure that population of women are productive at work. So from and finally, from a payer perspective, if I was taking this to market, I would price it in an affordable way, because guess what? The market's so big. If you have a market of 50, do the math here. If you have a market of 15 million women in the US and you charge $1,000 a year, what's the value of that market? Big. So, you don't need to charge a lot of money for this to be really viable. And so we don't think payers are really going to, be too discombobulated about the prospect of paying for something that, by the way, returns women to full productivity and a decent quality of life, and actually is reasonably affordable as well.